And the only thing we saw in Arvag, Switzerland, when we went, was the headstone. And his headstone was defined by the dates. And there was a dash in the middle. What are we going to do with that dash? That's our long-term vision. And I believe that he was looking at the long-term vision. And he's visualizing me as his great-great-grandson to say, I'm going to create opportunity because I know there's no opportunity here.
Hi, welcome back to ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I am your host, Art Calderon. I'm here with Reed Nyffeler, who runs a global company that has been growing astronomically, really, over the last several years. Reed is a father, and he's also a son and a husband, and keeps very busy with that. Some significant transition periods in his life right now. Reed, the original 4 episodes, we talked about priorities. Then we moved into habits, episodes 5 through 9, and then 10 through 13, know your purpose, right? Now here we are, episode 14, huge. And this is about beginning your journey of living your life on purpose, and specifically your long-term vision. What does a long-term vision look like? So what is the first step to starting your life on purpose?
Yeah, and as we looked at those previous chapters and really podcast episodes, I guess, it's a transition from theoretical to practical. And so many times, what's the difference between theory and practice? Theory is us thinking, how, what would this look like? And ultimately then practice saying, doing. It's the activity of doing. Instead of thinking, instead of believing, instead of hoping, instead of wishing, instead of dreaming, now we're doing.
And so, those other things are important, right?
Right.
Planning and hoping and dreaming, all important, but you can't just stay there.
Right. If you're doing without a dream, where are you going? And if you're dreaming without doing, you're not going anywhere. So I think that's really why the two have to work together, because, some of you are probably more theoretical, right? And as I look at, kind of a university setting, much of that is understanding the theories and practices and approaches that need to be taken. Then you go to your first job and it's practical. And really your boss is saying, I don't care what your theory is, I care what you're doing. And so that's kind of the melding of the two. It's saying I can study all the theory that I want to study, but I don't get the benefit of that. I always say information without application is worthless. And so that's the effect of theory without action. And so you can invest all your time in theory without practically applying that. And many times too, this is the hardest part for people, right? If you have a New Year's resolution or you have a dream or aspiration, that's fun. I mean, there's no conflict. There's no resistance. You can sit in your mind. You don't even have to share it with anybody. You can write this whole statement of your life on purpose and not share it with anybody. And you're like, wow, I'll be this amazing human if I could just live out this life on purpose. And then the very next day, you wake up and you have to do that dream, and it's tough, right? And maybe just to make it real practical and see why we get off track so easily, we have this beautiful dream, and think of it like a 5-year-old, right? And they say, what do you want to be, right? And we give them the opportunity to say, I want to be a fireman, right? I don't even know what I wanted to be, probably a teacher at that time, actually. And then, everybody receives that at that age. Oh, that's great, yeah, because they think of that wonder and that amazement at that stage. But then you get that same question as you're graduating college or going to college, like, who do you want to be? Oh, that's an industry that's tough, right? I mean, that's not a growth industry. Oh, there's always people looking for jobs there. Or, are you sure you're cut out to be there? And what's changed? You were 5 and had the same dream to be a firefighter, right? You're 20 something, you have a firefighter, and now people are giving you resistance. And so why? Because when theory goes to practice, that's an opportunity for insecurity to seep in. So what we're going to talk about in the podcast episodes from here is how to practically say insecurity is going to be there no matter what you're doing. What we need to do now is saying we're going to go forward regardless, right? There is no champion that was highly successful their first try. But over a period of time, through practice, through establishing a long-term vision and the 5-year milestones and the things we're going to walk through, they began to make progress. And so that's what leads into the long-term vision. And so many people, part of the reason that practical things don't work is they try to start today with, I'm just going to do something today, but they don't have that long-term vision, which is why we're going to start with a long-term vision. We're not going to start with today's actions, even in the moment or minute, which is we're going to get to at the end. We're going to start with a long-term vision because we'll lose track today if we're only orienting to the moment. And so just to set this in as we get into this process, if you were to go from here to pick your favorite destination, right? You don't start with saying, okay, where am I at today? Let's go. I'm pulling out of the parking lot. Should I take a right or a left? No, you start by putting the destination in the GPS. And then you decide whether you take a right or a left. That's the effect of a long-term vision. We're going to decide where do we want to end up and then plan the GPS of our life turn by turn from there. And so that's why long-term vision is where we start.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. A long-term vision. So we start like, where do we want to end up
Yep.
down the road, some period. Tell us about your long-term vision that you had presumably years ago, and how did you get there? And more importantly, I guess, who did you allow into that long-term vision to help you? Because you can't let everybody in. There's negative
Sure.
people that come in. There's people who just want to, don't want to see you succeed. But you gotta be open to some help, right? Who helps you
Sure.
with that long-term vision? What that look like?
So first, that long-term vision is going to start with your purpose statement, right? We crafted that in the previous episode. And so in the end, at the end of my life, right? And so I'm at the funeral, and ultimately, what would I want them to say? That's the long-term vision. That should be our purpose statement, that, through intuitive interaction, Reed propelled leaders over their self-imposed barriers to live out their unique purpose. So that's the end result I'm aspiring towards. Otherwise, the whole exercise of writing that was worthless. So I took this whole first half of the podcast, this series, and said, who do I want to be in the end? And so then I take that statement and I'd say, okay, in the end, I want to be identified by that. Now, that's just a writing on a wall until I put it into practice. So then now, okay, who's an intuitive leader he worked with? And over their long term, right, through intuitive interaction, what leaders did he work with and how did he propel them forward? So that's the practice of it all. So then at that funeral, they said, this is an example of somebody that ultimately had struggled in life, right? And so Reed had a conversation with them at a period of time, and then he understood where their self-imposed barrier was, and he propelled them over an extended period of time to do that. And here's an example of that. So that's putting that into practice. So this statement could be written on an epitaph on my tombstone that would say, Reed, through intuitive interaction, propelled leaders beyond their self-imposed barriers to live out their unique purpose in life. But in practice, it never happened, right? That's just an aspirational statement that we want people to believe about us, but it's not reality.
We just found it after you were gone, written down somewhere.
So now I take that statement and I'd say, okay, now who are the lives I want to impact? Right? And who are the lives going to impact? And so now we go back to our priorities. This is where we're starting with a long-term vision. Well, clearly, my first priority was God. So if I am going to prioritize any impact, it should be around faith, right? And so this was just last night. I had dinner with a group, and we were sitting at Kobe Steakhouse, which is a steakhouse in the area. And we were sitting there, and there was 3 other people. There was a group of 5 of us. It was actually my son and my in-laws and my wife. And the 3 other people that were sitting on the end were sitting there, and it happened to be that they both had a birthday. My son had a birthday, and this other person was 1 year older, exact same day, April 1st in this case, when we're filming this podcast. And so we're sitting there, and we talked about that. And they said, where do you go to school? And so they go to the same school. And we're like, well, that's happenstance. And so the conversation continued. They said, and we just tried out a church on Easter. And I said, interesting, what church? It happens to be go to the church we're going to. This is me living out my purpose in a practical sense for a long-term vision. I've never met this person, didn't even know where they were. We're sitting there, and I said, intuitive interaction. They listed the other churches they had considered, and they're trying to find a place. So they don't know what criteria. And while we're doing this intuitive interaction, they were discussing, they're saying, okay, we've tried these different churches, but it doesn't fit for this child or this child. It doesn't fit for us or this others. And so then I said, okay, that's a barrier for them. Their barrier is they cannot select a place their family should be planted with regard to their faith. And so my wife is obviously very good at this, understands this. She's interjecting and offering her insights as to it all. And so in the end, through that conversation, here we're just having dinner at Kobe Steakhouse. Have you ever been there? They're basically cooking it at a hibachi grill in front of you. And in the end, they're coming now at a Wednesday night thing this week to then test out with their child, who my wife, who happens to be working on Wednesday nights, is going to meet their 7th grader. My son's a 6th grader, and make sure he's connected at the same time. Why? Because their purpose, they realize they're trapped in their lives, and they know they need a component of faith. And they just left an Easter service the day before, and they're trying to find a place, and they don't know how to interject. And so that's a barrier in their life. And so then this is just one simple example of me recognizing in a practical sense, my long-term vision isn't a single person. It's a purpose statement. And here's this person I met at dinner in a hibachi grill environment that had a first priority issue for me, faith, that they were struggling with. I have to interject, right? And so then I think long-term, I want to see piles of those stories, right? So long-term vision would be that the whole room is filled with people that said, you know what? Regardless of how busy he's doing, regardless if he's celebrating time and his family's celebrating time to celebrate their 12-year-old son, he still sees a barrier in someone else's life that he just happened to meet in a dinner environment that is walking through that through intuitive interaction, asking questions. What were they looking for? What family needs were they trying to address with a church environment? And here they're looking for years in their case and for a place to fit in. And so that's the solution. So that's the long-term vision. I'm sitting there. So, this reminded me of a story that where am I at? Because I am here, I believe, as a direct result of someone else's long-term vision. And so I had an opportunity about maybe it's been 7 years ago, to go back to where my family originated from. And that was in Arvagen, Switzerland. And so in the 1800s, late 1800s, they immigrated here in 1888. My great grandfather was looking around and recognized that he had 3 brothers and himself. And they probably had 5 to 7 acres in Arvagen, Switzerland. And he recognized
Between all of them.
between all of them,
Yeah.
And he looked, and all the neighbors' plots were there, and land was going to be impossible. And so a message had come across that his neighbor, who had also relocated to what is Duncan, Nebraska, and said, "Hey, I need a laborer." So my great grandfather, as soon as he turned 18, turned to his father and said, "I got to go. This is my opportunity." I look around, there's no land here. And the great grandfather got from his dad the money he had in the pocket on a one-way train ticket, ultimately boat and train ticket, to end up in Duncan, Nebraska.
But what year was this? What year?
This was 1888. They immigrated.
18 years old and went to a whole other country.
A whole other country he'd
Amazing.
never heard, and it was only information that came from his former neighbor that they had trusted. And why did he do that? Because he had a long-term vision. He's not looking at what's best for him in the moment. You're leaving your family forever. He only went back one other time in his life in his mid-40s to tell mom I made it. And we didn't have interactive technology where mom's checking him, "Hey, how's your trip going?" And that trip wasn't a flight. I mean, we can fly there in probably 12 hours.
Yeah.
Think about this. He's leaving on a train to go to the coast in Arvagen, Switzerland. That's not in a port. And you're hopping on a boat that probably took a week to 2 weeks to get to a port in America. Then you're hopping on a train that was probably a couple of weeks, because it was a steam engine at that point, and the Golden Spike had just been recently laid. And you're following that train all the way through these stops, and it's going 12, 15 miles an hour. So we're talking about a months-long journey.
Wow.
With the clothes on your back and the money dad gave you, and you're trying to meet people you've never met and largely don't speak their language, right? He was speaking German in that place. Why was he doing all that? It was not for the short term. He's saying, I know that the generations ahead will not be able to survive on this land. I look around, there's 4 of us and 5 acres. So then if I have children, which he aspired to have, clearly he did have children, I'm not going to be able to do it. So he knew from his neighbor, there's a tons of land available in Nebraska, right? What ultimately became Nebraska, or was Nebraska, I guess it was a state at the time, and other places in America. And he could take that trade, what he'd learned up to this point from his family, and he did it as a service to both sides. He served his brothers by vacating the land. None of them left. None of them took a risk. All 3 of them subdivided that land, but they had his share now. He did it for his dad, who was trying to support his family in a tight area, right? And ultimately, when I went back there, that farm was long gone. And the only thing we saw in Arvagen, Switzerland, when we went, was the headstone. And his headstone was defined by the dates. And there was a dash in the middle. What are we going to do with that dash? That's our long-term vision. And I believe, and I'll continue to tell this story as it goes throughout this podcast, that he was looking at the long-term vision. And he's visualizing me as his great-great-grandson to say, I'm going to create opportunity because I know there's no opportunity here. And interestingly, I believe Arvagen, Switzerland, as I was there, the buildings are largely the same they probably were in the 1800s. You could see they're there. And so that is why I am using my purpose statement to propel leaders, is so I can have an impact on someone else that can change their family's generation. Just like that dinner conversation. I know the impact of faith on my life. So here, and I made a decision to, in commitment to God and through Jesus Christ when I was 15. And here's a 13-year-old at his birthday sitting there. Is that going to happen in his life if his family doesn't make a decision to put him in a church environment? And think of the generations that'll change through that 13-year-old who's largely trying to figure out who he is. And so that is exactly the same decision I can help them make by breaking down that barrier that would otherwise long-term impact their life, no different than my great-grandfather made by changing my life by making the decision to come to America.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. So do you think that was your great-grandfather?
Yes, it was my great-great-grandfather
Yeah.
that immigrated here,
Okay.
correct, yeah.
Do you think he had the foresight to know I'm going to establish generations here in this foreign land. I'm going to get married. I'm going to have kids. They're going to have kids, and they're going to have kids. And somehow this decision I'm making now is going to set life up better for them years down the road.
Well, I think at the other side of that is, and this is maybe where a lot of people are at, is saying, whatever I'm doing now, I'm on the treadmill of life. I'm in this hamster wheel and it's not going anywhere. I think that was obvious, right? I mean, he looks around at the land and says, where's it going to be? I mean, you look at Europe, right? There's hundreds of millions of people there, and that land is all spoken for.
Yeah.
And so I think, if anything, whether it sets up the generations, he knew where he wasn't going to set up the generations, right? He had seen his grandfather and his neighbors and everybody else, and they're just fighting for land. But I can say, first of all, part of your long-term vision is saying, whatever I'm doing today is not working. So if I'm going to decide that tomorrow is different, what I'm saying for the long-term vision is think as far ahead as you can.
Yeah.
So whether he thought about it or not, we should wake up saying today's not working. And I'm not just worried about tomorrow. I'm worried about decades ahead. And the longer we think, the more likely we're going to get there. The longer term we think, right? If we think, can we make it to the mailbox today? Okay. What are we going to do tomorrow? And we're back home, right? But if we're thinking long-term, generations ahead, we're going to plan accordingly, right? Just like we're planning a long-term trip that's going to take, in his case, months to get there.
Yeah. So there's no way he could have conceptualized what Nebraska was going to look like 150 years later. There's no way. But he knew, one, his current situation, not sustainable,
That's
not
right.
good.
That's right.
Not going to set his generations
That's
up
right.
for success. And also in our lives, we can see, okay, where I'm at now is not where I want to be. It's
Right.
not going to be good for me.
That's
It's not
right.
going to be good for whatever legacy I leave. So let's take that step of faith.
That's right.
Let's make this long-term plan, and let's start making these steps so that whatever the future looks like, it's going to be better than what I have right now.
Yeah, and I think there was, as we then went to Duncan, Nebraska. After we were in Argonne, Switzerland, went to Duncan, Nebraska, where he immigrated to, and there was evidence of his character there, because no matter where we go, we're still the same person.
There's evidence
Right.
of his character there, even when you went to go
That's
visit.
right. In the photos, in the stories, and the information. I'll get to that in a second. But here's a super important point. This is why we started with eternal, transcendent, and universal when we're building this. Because no matter what your vision is, it's applying you. You can change your vision 1,000 times, but your character is going on that trip. And so if you have not clearly identified who you are through your purpose statement, no matter what your dream and vision is, it still includes you. That's why we were at the theory defining who we want to be. That's our purpose statement. And so, as I saw and went to Arvagen, Switzerland, there was limited evidence of his character. There was only evidence of his father's existence in the form of a headstone in the place that was there. However, when I went to Duncan, Nebraska, and I talked to extended family that was there was evidence of his character. And so he was a risk taker, right? There's evidence, clearly a risk taker. There's evidence that he took risks going forward. Then there's evidence that he was a culture builder, right? And so I'll give you the two examples of what I found there. Number one is he took a risk to go there. Then he signed off on his own plot of land, right? So back then, if you signed on, you could be essentially earn that property by managing it for a period of time. And so he signed on to that land. And while he was there, he knew that he wanted to reestablish a community. And so the first thing they did was built a church, and he worked to invest in building the church, and he was the first schoolmaster. Because at the time, it's changed now that churches are meeting in schools, but at the time, schools met in churches.
Right.
And so they built a church in the center of the town, and he was kind of a leader with regard to that and became the first schoolmaster because evidently he had the most formal education of the group, right? I mean, back then you didn't have a formal education, so he at least knew how to read and write and was a student, and so he became the schoolmaster. And he ultimately had 4 children. He had 4 sons. And then through that, they were the first ones to get really a grade school education, kind of 2nd, 3rd grade until they were capable of working the farm. Then the farm needed them. And so in that case, they had a plan where they were ultimately building that as a schoolmaster. And so he was saying, I know the future requires a level of community and education. And that was a part of his character. Now, many of us were just like, I'm surviving. There's countless people that immigrated and he says, I'm surviving.
Right.
I don't have time to invest to be a schoolmaster. And education, I don't have time for it.
Or build a church.
Right? But he knew that in order for generations to sustain, they needed education and community. And as a result of that, look at where I'm at now. I'm building community and I'm educating. And that I am also a risk taker. So as a result of his actions, that has either been in my blood or inspired me, or maybe subconsciously, I'm living that out, right? I'm taking a risk, starting a business, building community with regard to our franchise organization, and then ultimately educating through the podcast and other pieces. And that's evident of his community as he was the first person in the schoolmaster.
That's awesome. So he obviously had a plan. I mean, it had to be very general because there was a lot of unknowns. Oh my goodness, you're in the wild country. You still had all kinds of dangers. But he definitely had to take some steps.
That's right.
He had to make a plan and say, okay, this is not where I want to be here in the family farm. I need to go to this other place. And you mentioned he borrowed some or took some money from dad. Dad gave him some money.
Yep.
What are some steps that that our listeners should take to shape that long-term vision? What are some initial steps? Because it can be kind of daunting, right? I'm going to go to Nebraska, and I've never been there before. I'm going to go to this other place in my life. What are some concrete steps they can take?
Yeah, and so that we'll continue on that story because it's so relevant here. And first of all, I would say this: when you're establishing a long-term vision, it's going to be cloudy. I remember in college, my eyesight was going a little bit. And in fact, I had things were not as clear in a longer range. Right, I'd be driving, and I used to be able to see the stop sign or the road signs in advance, and then I had to get closer and closer. And so then I went to the eye doctor. And while I was at the eye doctor, he gave me these lenses. And immediately I remember wearing glasses, and I left there. I was like, there's leaves on those trees. I can see this sign a lot further. And
You didn't even realize.
I didn't even realize how much I couldn't see
Right.
because I was living in that vision. And that's the way this is going to be initially, right? I had my head pointed in that direction. And that's what you should be doing now because you have your vision statement. But you can't see all the way down the road because your vision is impeded, and we need to get those glasses to focus. And so the first thing they do is they test your vision. And so that's what I'd recommend as a practical application. You're not going to have a clear vision at the beginning. I always tell people, write your business plan, then tear it up. Because as soon as you put it into practice, you're going to need to evolve, right? And so in our brand, we're launching in other countries. And so I was there launching them. I said, this is going to be a lot of trial and error, right? The first recipe is not written, it's tested, right? So like, do I need more salt or less salt? I don't know, put it in there. Oh, that was terrible. Take out the salt, right? Whatever the case might be. And that's the way this vision works. And so the first thing you should do is start heading the right direction you think it's going to be, and then calibrate according to the clarity you see. And so I'll give an example. So back to my great-great-grandfather. So he knew that he wanted to be a farmer, but what he didn't know was the climate, the soil, and the seed, what was readily available. So when I was there researching the story, we're now corn farmers, but that's not where we started. He started planting all sorts of things, right? Because he had no idea.
In
Nebraska, right?
Okay.
Because they had no idea. They didn't have the weather information we have now.
Yeah.
They didn't have the tractors. I mean, they basically had a single mule and your, rudimentary hoe and no barns. And so he got whatever seed was there that somebody else had planted before, tried to figure out how to plant it, how high, how low, leveraging his previous experience and trying that. And so as I was talking to extended family members that had seen this whole process, they tried all sorts of crops because they were thinking, well, what do we want to eat, right? So that's one direction. And whatever else, his direction was he knew he wanted to be a farmer. So then he didn't know what to plant. That's the long-term vision. I know our direction as our purpose statement is a farmer in that regard. We've defined by our purpose statement where we want to go, but we don't know what's going to work. So we've got to clarify the application of that vision. And so here's what he's doing. He's testing the crops. Well, he first was diversifying, right? Because if you only plant corn only, and you realize it doesn't grow in that area, now you have no crop. But if you plant corn, they did some beans, they did some tomatoes, they did some potatoes, they did all sorts of things, and some crops made it and some didn't. They didn't have that nice fancy weather map that shows what you can plant in your region.
There was no app at that time.
There was no app at the time. There's no how much sunlight and moisture you're getting. They didn't know how much rain they're getting on a daily basis. There's no forecast at the time, right? They looked up at the sky and said, is it going to rain today? And I needed it to rain, right? So they planted close to water. It was right off the river, and they would irrigate as needed by hand, of course, and ultimately plant accordingly. And so they would diversify. They would diversify the application of their vision. And that's the practical thing to do here. And so we start with regard to our priorities. We take that, whatever your priorities were, mine happen to be faith, family, productivity or work, and then ultimately recreation. And so I take that, and this is my diversification of the crops. I take my purpose statement, and I gave you that example of the intuitive interaction in a faith-based setting, right? And then I call my children, right? And that's the family application. So I have a daughter that's a teacher. And this is her first year going through teaching. And so there's some barriers with regard to that. And so I'm listening to her, having conversations with her. And then I realize, okay, how do I help her? It's her life. How to help her overcome that barrier, being a brand new teacher, just recently graduated from college, and that's a transition in life. That's a going from, I recently talked to a college graduate that just graduated last May, and a similar thing. It's like being 16 and 30 at the same time. 16 because you don't know what you're doing, 30 because you have all the responsibilities. And so how do you help them in that period of time as a barrier? And so that's applying my purpose statement there. Then third, it's in work. I do that all the time. I talk to franchisees and employees and I say, hey, where are you at and what's your long-term vision and how do I help you in that? So that is where you plant your 3 crops. So you take your purpose statement you crafted previously and you plant in those 3-4 areas in purpose, right? And so one of the recreational things I do is I play basketball on Saturdays. And so a couple of months ago, there was a 16, 17-year-old kid who was there who was trying to make his high school team. And so I'm not athletic. I mean, I'm athletic. I know it's obvious I'm athletic, I guess. I didn't want to brag, but it's obvious I'm athletic. Well, I can't jump as high or anything else, but I at least understand after periods of time watching the game and understanding the game. And I saw a couple things he was doing. And I said, hey, I'm just here to help you make your team because I'm noticing these things and you're on my team. Here's some things you can do. And so that's in a recreational sense. I'm saying, hey, use your offhand or guard in this regard so that you can, try to make your team because that was his vision. That's what he wanted to do. And so what are we doing? Just like my great-grandfather, we are taking that vision. He wanted to be a farmer, in our case, our purpose statement, and we're planting 4 different crops, in my case, the priorities, and I'm seeing where it works. And that's going to then clarify that long-term vision. It's going to bring that closer. I'll begin to see the leaves on the trees because I'm looking at trees, just as I gave that analogy. I'm looking at road signs. I'm looking at long distances and short distances.
So you're trying to see where your purpose statement fits in, and you're being purposeful about applying the purpose statement in different situations in life,
in your priorities
that come to you or even go after, and then see which one bears the most fruit and start following that, and that'll help develop.
Clarify your long-term vision, because as we get to the next podcast, it'll be about milestones. So our long-term vision will be clarified by applying our purpose statement in our priorities. That's the starting point.
Okay.
So you take that purpose statement and apply for priorities of long-term priorities or our long-term. They should not change. Faith, if you talk to me 50 years from now, right, I'll be really old, but still 50 years from now, I hope that my purpose statement is clarified and still the same. My priorities, faith, family, productivity, and recreation are prioritized. Right now, maybe if I retire, I'll probably still have productivity. I can't not be productive, right?
Retiring, I don't see it,
yes.
But okay.
And that's where there's priorities. So start there, practically start there. And as we work through these podcasts, I'll continue to tell that progression of the stories of the generations as they created interim milestones that ultimately I'm living in what I believe to be a component of the long-term vision that was clarified going forward. So apply your statement to your priorities as you move forward. And that'll clarify your vision.
To your priorities. All right. Now, anything else that people need to keep in mind while they're, remember our sort of our theme here about living your life on purpose. What should people keep in mind while they're doing this?
So many people will focus on their failures and their missteps, but focus on your purpose. So the number one thing when you're applying it is not about your mistakes. I think we live in a society.
Those are temporary, right?
Those are temporary.
And we're talking long term.
That's right. Don't focus on any of that. Focus on your purpose. You've crafted your purpose statement. That should be now your focal point. No matter whether you're positive, negative, or anything in between, you're always going to have naysayers. And if you're focused on those, you're constantly changing. So focus on that purpose. And then when you focus on the purpose, recognize this is a marathon, not a sprint. We're talking about 50 years later, in my case, that is my long term. So I am not to race to that deadline to say, hey, do you believe that I'm living my life on purpose? Do you believe? No. It is a lifetime of that, right? Just as it is now 150 almost years later from when my great grandfather immigrated here. And I believe in part, and fulfilling the intent or purpose that he came to the United States for.
Right.
And he didn't even see that in his lifetime. So if we're doing this truly with eternity in mind and universality and ultimately have our mass application for this, then we are thinking long-term, right? If we do it transcendently as well.
Yeah. So let's all try and keep these principles in mind. Specifically, I love the way you talked about your grandfather, knowing that for generations to come, they're going to be influenced in a good way by the decisions he makes now. And it's so tempting to just think about the here and now.
That's right.
What's going to affect me today and tomorrow and this week. But when you start thinking about literally hundreds of years and generations later, how is the decisions I make now going to affect that?
That's right.
So that's really good. So we're kind of out of time now, but a lot of heavy things to think about. I'm looking forward to our next podcast. Thank you all, listeners, for sharing your time with us. Share this podcast with others so Reed and I can continually be infamous on the web. Thank you very much for your time, Reed. Thank you for your time and for your insight. Next time we're going to talk about setting a 5-year milestone, which is very concrete, right? 5-year milestone. Until then, I'm Art Calderon. Be purposeful.
Now, one more thing, Art. I know you can't wait for this, but many of you are saying, I don't know how to craft a vision. You've put your purpose statement together, and here's where it starts. You need to decide today that whatever I am doing today is not my long-term vision. That's a starting point. That you are not happy with the present. Because if you're happy with the present, it leads to complacency and you'll never achieve your vision. So today decide, you know what? Whatever it is, just like my great-great-grandfather saying, whatever is right here is not my future. And that was his first step. He didn't know me, never even knew that I would exist necessarily. However, what he knew was that where he was not where he wanted to be, nor did he want his future generation to be. And I believe there's many of you that are right there right now, and you're afraid to take that step. Take your purpose statement, and for the first practical step, apply that to your priorities, just like I talked about. Plant those crops in those fields and see what yields a return. Start today. The longer you wait, the further off your vision and your purpose statement are. So start today, and we'll talk through the series of podcasts from here on how to apply that to your life at every step.